My earliest memory is as just a little toddler, standing at my front door. It was a French door with little panes all down even at my level. And Mother was very, very mad at me, really cross with me. And she threatened to go off and leave me, which she did. She opened the front door and closed it behind her and left me standing behind those little panes of glass looking out, just crying. My heart was broken because my mother was leaving me. And she walked down the sidewalk and out of sight.
This series, Seasons of Life, is about a new way of looking at human development, a way that says we can't understand the young without understanding the old, and we can't understand young or old without understanding everyone else in between. It's called the lifespan perspective. In programs to come, we're going to follow this perspective from the beginning of life to the end. We'll be guided by scientists in biology, anthropology, sociology, and most of all, psychology. But we're going to hear from other experts as well, maybe the real experts, people at all stages of life's journey, people fashioning their lives and telling their stories. That's what this program is about, both the individual story and the story of the seasons. We begin by asking, how does human development appear from the new lifespan perspective? We'll hear about 3 developmental clocks. Then we'll ask, what is the meaning of the earliest memory we have? And what is the meaning of the stories that you and I create with our lives? This is the first sound of the seasons of life. In a year, it will change, just as we did, into something new.
Dada. Dada.
The first word. It will evolve into something new again, something with feeling.
Happy birthday, Daddy. Happy birthday. Happy birthday to you.
Then we'll use words to tell the story of life's milestones, like the first day of school.
Each day I'm saying, I don't want to go, I don't want to go, I don't want to go. But it's going to be fun because I get to go on the school bus.
The first bike ride.
Well, I wasn't scared because I thought my mom was holding on to the back of it until I looked back, and then all of a sudden I got nervous, and there was the car right in front of me.
The first trip to the lingerie department.
I remember being real embarrassed because, like, you're with your mom. You know you want to do it, but the whole process of, you're standing in this lingerie department or this teen department, looking around and thinking, I hope nobody sees me here.
The first kiss.
And I didn't know what I was doing. I was just so nervous, and I was like, well, I guess it's what you're supposed to do. I don't know.
For some of us, the first child.
And I'm sitting there for 2 hours with the baby, crying my eyes out because I had this thing in my arms. My life has changed, and it was very clear, and I had the evidence in my lap.
The first grandchild.
My daughter told me, Mom, I'm going to have a baby. And right away I thought, oh my God, that means I'm old. Wait, I'm going to be a grandmother. I can't be a grandmother.
The first great-grandchild.
He called up and he said, I waited until I was real sure. But he said, how would you like to be a great grandma? And I said, that'd be the best thing in the world.
And finally, for all of us, the last word.
We used to talk about death, he and I often, but he knew it, and he says, what are you going to do? This is it, this is life. We got to go.
To understand how the sounds of the seasons change, you have to take a special approach. Professor Richard Lerner, a lifespan psychologist, explains.
When you study development, you have to study change. That is, development implies that things are moving, that things are altering, that things are different. And the only way to get at development or difference or alteration is by studying things at more than one point in time. That's the only way you can detect the change. Now, scientists have come up with several different ways of designing research so that they can observe things at more than one point in time. Probably the best way is one or another form of what's called longitudinal research. That's where you take the same group of people and you study them repeatedly at different ages.
Several longitudinal studies have gone on now for over half a century. These pioneering efforts have taught us to be aware of three factors affecting our development. We change, 1, because our bodies change, 2, because the world around us changes, and 3, because our own inner needs change. It's as though 3 clocks were ticking in the background of our lives. The first is the biological clock, which governs our physical growth. It's the body's way of keeping time. The biological clock specifies a time to be born, a time to reproduce, and in the long run, a time to die. It's this clock that changes our bodies in adolescence and prompts that first trip to the lingerie department. The second clock affecting our development is the social clock, which is society's way of keeping time. The biological clock builds a body, but the social clock shapes a person for society. When we were 5 or 6, it said, it's time to go to school. And throughout life, it tells us to act our age. Then there's the psychological clock, which stands for an individual's way of keeping time. It tells us how old we feel, not how old we are. One woman of 43 might say, I'm not ready to be a grandmother. Another, it's about time. The difference? They're psychological clocks. In addition to making us aware of 3 developmental clocks, longitudinal research has brought a hopeful perspective. Professor Lerner.
We remain open, we remain flexible, we remain plastic, and while there is a linkage between early development and later life, there are new directions to development that occur as a consequence of factors impinging on the person at each point in the lifespan, and there's always some flexibility in the person that will allow you to redirect the life course at any point in its existence.
If we get off to a bad start in life, we're not stuck. Openness and flexibility speak to the importance of the psychological clock, of the individual.
I think we'll be learning ultimately more about the active role of the individual. That is, we'll be learning how individuals can actively be forces in producing their own development.
The lifespan perspective has made us aware of 3 clocks that pace human development. It tells us that we're not stuck on a single path, that there are ways we can steer our own life course. That's the present story of the seasons. But what about me? What about the story of the individual experiencing the seasons? One way of understanding an individual's life is by listening to his or her story. But to make sense of what you hear, you have to understand what a life story is. You have to understand a kind of memory that psychologists are now just beginning to probe. It's autobiographical memory, memory of the sights and sounds and smells and feelings woven into the fabric of our lives. It begins with our very first memory, like this one of a man we'll meet later in the series.
When I was real small, I can remember the first house that we stayed had real high steps, you know. And I remember walking to the edge of the porch and my mother grabbed me and pulling me back. And I've talked to my mother lots about the house on, I guess it was on Chapel Street in Atlanta, Georgia. I'm from Atlanta, see. And she said, you couldn't remember that. See, you was only 18 months old. You couldn't remember. I said, I do remember, Mama.
Most people say their first memory comes from a time when they were 3 or 4. But are these dates, and indeed are the memories themselves, accurate?
I don't know if first memories are accurate. I would suspect, though, that in general they are not perfectly accurate, but on the other hand, most of the time they're not complete fabrications either.
Professor Dan McAdams studies autobiographical memory.
Cognitive psychologists have shown us, and common sense might suggest the same, that what we remember from the past gets reconstructed, gets changed a little bit over time. Sometimes we do that on purpose, and other times things just get changed unwittingly. We truly think we remember it clearly and accurately, but some objective standards suggest that we don't.
The great child psychologist Jean Piaget had a vivid memory of nearly being kidnapped at the age of 2. He could picture a scuffle in which the face of his nurse was scratched by the kidnappers. But later in life, he learned that the nurse had made up the entire story. The clarity with which he had seen the event in his mind and the personal conviction he had about its truth was no proof that it ever happened. One of the ways psychologists study autobiographical memory is by interpreting life stories. And one of the insights that's been gained from interpretation is that it really doesn't matter if the event happened or not. Whether first memories are based on reality or fantasy, the key to them lies elsewhere. It lies in their revealing place in the life story. They are first. Professor McAdams.
There is some reason to believe that people choose their early memories with some kind of unconscious eye towards their current identity and what they see to be the future. And thus, one's early memories can serve as a reasonable story beginning for one's current identity.
In McAdams' view, early memories appear to be about the past, but they're really about the present. Maybe he's onto something. Take an early memory of yours and ask, why do I remember that moment and not the hour before or the hour after? Why that day and not the day before or the day after? It's possible that the selection of a moment to remember is made because of patterns we see in our lives today. Patterns like wanting a mother's approval, like, do what I say or I'll leave you.
She opened the front door and closed it behind her and left me standing behind those little panes of glass looking out, just crying. My heart was broken because my mother was leaving me. And she walked down the sidewalk and out of sight. I can still see the sidewalk that she walked down and the cracks in the sidewalk. That had a real lasting effect on me. It was like, you do what I say or I'll leave you.
Mary's life reflects a number of themes, and she has gone through important changes, but the fear of disapproval revealed in her first memory has been dominant.
I was raised to be a very submissive person, always obedient to my parents, and so I learned that if I wanted to have interaction with people, I had to do what was pleasing to them. Well, this carried over into my marriage, and so I tried very hard not to do anything that was displeasing to my husband, but I occasionally did, and it wasn't very pleasant afterward.
Mary was born and raised in Texas and married at 18. She completed 1 year of college, then started her family. Over the next 25 years, there were moments of happiness, surprise, and joy, but there was also the old familiar theme.
Mealtime was a terrible time. We all dreaded mealtime because it was bad, but I always ended up crying, not saying anything back, just feeling like I had obviously done something wrong and deserved whatever I got for it, and was repentant that I hadn't done everything exactly the way I was supposed to.
Mary held on to a long-standing dream and went back to school at the age of 43. It was a turning point in her life.
After I started back to school and realized that a lot of other people didn't think that that was necessarily the way it was supposed to be, it opened a lot of new worlds. I came to realize that I had some value as a person, that some of my thoughts were pretty worthwhile, or some people seemed to think they were, and maybe worth asserting myself a little.
Mary has since accomplished a great deal, but it's been a struggle. For her, the struggle began at that French door, seeing her mother walk away. And yet Mary's mother doesn't remember the incident. Did it really happen? Professor McAdams and others suggest that it makes no difference. Fact or fabrication, the scene at the door symbolizes Mary's enduring struggle. What comes first in her memory today says something about who she is today. The opening scene is important in a life story, but so are the later chapters. There we find the high points, the low points, the turning points, the new beginnings that stand out in bold print. For one man we'll come to know in this series, a turning point came in a Canadian hospital in 1983.
I was working at that time in the recreation department as a music coordinator, and my job was to go around to the different wards and sing for the clients. I kept on hearing from the different people, you should hear this fellow play the piano. And so finally my curiosity got to me, and I went and I found what ward he is on, and then I went and heard him play. And I remember just staring at him and looking down at his piano, and like I thought my eyes were deceiving me, and I remember that it's just like a magic moment. Something's happening here, because I'm hearing, it sounds like a man's playing with two hands, and then I see him, and I see he's only got one hand, and the other one's paralyzed. I suppose you could say I've been John's sidekick ever since.
A magic moment and the beginning of a new and important relationship. A first. Professor McAdams calls events like this nuclear episodes. A nuclear episode is a significant scene in your life story. It could be the best moment in your life, or, as a man from Ohio will tell us in a future program, it could be the worst.
I was walking up the street, and the police cruiser pulled up to the street where I was going to cross. So I just waited for the police cruiser to move, and he didn't move. And suddenly he got out of the car, and he walked over to me, and he said, Mr. Taylor, there's been an accident, and your son's been involved in it, and, they need you to come and identify his body.
We'll learn what followed in these life stories and the meaning of these episodes in later programs. But for now, we should know that in his study of autobiographical memory, Professor McAdams has found that how you describe nuclear episodes often reveals important personality characteristics, like a concern for intimacy. His finding was based on another method for studying lives.
Well, we can measure individual differences in intimacy motivation through a special kind of test that we administer to people, and we find that, indeed, people who are high in intimacy motivation, when they tell us about nuclear episodes in their lives, high points and low points, oftentimes these nuclear episodes contain interpersonal themes. They have to do with communication, with sharing, with love and liking, or loss and separation, either positive or negative interpersonal themes. They show many more of these kinds of nuclear episodes than people who are low in intimacy motivation.
According to McAdams, personality traits like a desire for intimacy are revealed when people recount the significant events in their lives. Are these traits revealed in descriptions of everyday events? When McAdams applied the same coding system to ordinary episodes, he found no connection with personality traits. His conclusion? When we describe the key moments in our life stories, we reveal who we are. When we describe ordinary episodes, we do not. Both early memories and nuclear episodes reveal something about the self. String them together and you have the heart of a life story. For McAdams, the story not only reveals the self, it is the self.
If I think of my life then as a story that continually evolving and changing and being rewritten, then I think it gives me a sense of myself as complex, as changing but staying the same at the same time. I think it's a useful way of thinking of the self.
And there's a useful way you can put together the ideas of self, story, and the three developmental clocks. Think of the biological clock as making our stories like all other stories, tales of birth, reproduction, and death. Think of the social clock as making our stories like some other stories, like those of one generation but not of another. And then think of the psychological clock as making our stories like no other story, unique expressions of who we are. All three clocks affect our stories, but it's the psychological clock that reveals the self.
I'm the daddy. I know what it is to be a daddy.
The man we're about to meet, Arnell Douglas, is in his early 40s. All that we've heard about the lifespan perspective, about the three clocks, about first memories and nuclear episodes is found in his life story. This man, who knows what it means to be a daddy, was born in Chicago in 1945. His first memory of life involves his own father. He was a little boy sick in bed. His mother phoned his dad to come and take him to the hospital.
And I was anxious because I knew my dad was going to come and I was going to get a chance to ride this big, black, shiny Plymouth, right? And he walked in, this big, sort of lanky fellow walked in. And I think he even picked me up and took me to the car. You get the smell of him, the grease and the cigarette, that kind of thing.
His father drove him to the hospital, and that was the last time Arnell rode in the big black shiny Plymouth. For most of his childhood, Arnell's father just wasn't there.
You know, on a summer day, you know, after school, all the kids out playing and kids with their dad and their mom in the cars and they're shining their cars and everything. And the dad takes the kid for a spin. Well, where's my dad? And I'm crying, man, I'm going crazy because I don't have a dad. And kids would laugh at me, you dummy, everybody has a dad.
Arnell would see his father 2 or 3 times a year. He spent his childhood trying to make him part of his life. But when he was 12, he gave up. His story came to a turning point, a nuclear episode.
The memory I have is of asking him, would he allow me to come to his garage every Saturday just to learn a trade? And he told me, hell no. So you can't come, you talk too much, you ask too many questions. And I said, well, just please let me come. I swear I won't say anything. No, you can't come, just don't come back. I mean, it was all he could do is just to keep from chasing me out of the place. And I was devastated. And it was then that I knew he didn't like me. Before, I just never knew what was going on.
His mother responded the way she always did to her son's hurt and disappointment. She tried to turn his thoughts from the painful past to the hopeful future.
She was this real country black lady, my mother, you know. It doesn't make any difference what happened, you just go on. You just move on and just do whatever you have to do. She never seemed to have let things get her down, and she always used every little thing to help her spirit.
And so Arnell left childhood with his father's rejection, his mother's hope, and his own anger. The biological clock brought him to adolescence.
So I got this unfocused anger in me, but I know there's great things, right? But I'm not pulling them together. In 1960, 58, 59, and 60, several things happened.
The most important thing was a major historical event, the Civil Rights Movement. His anger poured out. He marched, he protested, and he sometimes got arrested. Nonetheless, he continued his fight to overcome.
During the Civil Rights Movement for 4 years, John, I mean, I have never lived so intensely as I did during that period, okay? And I know where things could have gotten out of hand and I could have gotten shot or hurt. The only thing ever happened to me is a cop hit me in the head with a gun. And it wasn't, you know, beyond fright. That's the only physical thing ever happened. I always had people looking out for me.
Some of the people looking out for him encouraged Arnell to go to college. It was about time, they said. As he worked his way into young adulthood, he began to hear the social clock, earning a bachelor's degree, then a master's. Along the way, he met and married his wife, Nancy. They were both in school when they became parents. For Arnell, it was another nuclear episode.
The greatest thing on earth, the birth of my kids. And I tell you, my emotions welled up, boy, I didn't know what to do. I mean, here is this little bitty baby who's nothing without us.
Now it was Arnell's turn to be the dad, and he was ready. Fatherhood was right on time for his psychological clock. He began the stories of 2 sons in sharp contrast to his own. First Adam, then Andreas.
We had said from the start when Adam was born, we knew what we were going to do with our babies. Nancy went to school and I kept Adam. Or I went to school and Nancy kept Adam. Everywhere we went, Adam went. We went to a restaurant, he went. If he couldn't go, we didn't go. I mean, it was simple as that. I remember studying William Blake with this kid. I used to read William Blake to this kid. I mean, I used to write papers with this kid on my desk. And we treated Andreas the same way we treated Adam. We took Andreas everywhere. We did everything with Andreas. I mean, we didn't separate the two, you know.
Some things have changed for Arnell since those days of young adulthood. Now in his early 40s, he works as a college counselor and teaches high school in the evening. He rarely sees his dad, but the deep anger and pain have been replaced by quiet pity. After 15 years together, he and Nancy are now divorced. But one thing has not changed in his life. He is still, first and foremost, a dad.
We say we love each other 1,000,000 times a day. I mean, this kid calls me, say, I love you, Dad. You know, and I'm sitting in my office with these college kids, and they think this is a girl I'm talking to until I say his name. And they say, how old are they? I said, one is 14 and one is 10.
But they won't be 14 and 10 forever. The 3 clocks that govern the transitions of life will continue to tick, and the time will eventually come for Arnell's sons to leave home. Arnell isn't anxious to see it happen.
We have to stay together as family. There's no ifs, and you can't go to Mississippi and never see me. That's dumb. I don't care where you are. If it costs money, you have to make the effort. We have to make the effort to see one another.
From beginning to end, the recurring theme in Arnell's life story is fatherhood. The theme was present in his first memory of life and in key nuclear episodes. It's present in his expectations for the future. Arnell's story tells us who he is. I'm the daddy, he says. I know what it is to be a daddy. In programs to come, we'll hear stories like this from all the seasons of life. We'll hear how people respond to the biological, the social, and the psychological clocks. We'll hear how researchers in the social sciences interpret the ticking of these clocks. The new lifespan perspective is telling us that we're not stuck on the path on which we started, that we're capable of revising our stories and our lives. We can change a heritage not only for ourselves, but for the next generation, as Arnell's doing for his sons.
I'd love to be a dad.
Yeah? How many kids you want?
2.
What would you do with them?
What would I do with them?
Beat them.
I teach them. I tell them how the world is, tell them the facts of life, and teach them how to get through school and what they want to, if they want to decide what they want to be, and all that you have to do to be a parent and be a dad.